How are you still a conservative, Nadeem? Can I?
Because
Because your party is addicted to this theology.
Can I welcome you to our host, Hilary Lawson, for Lies, Damn Lies and Economics.
So welcome to this morning's debate. So governments, bankers and economists spend a great deal of time predicting the economy. Their forecasts have a profound effect on policy, and the forecasts, though, are often wrong. And critics argue we just don't have a credible theory of how the economy works. In 2023, 70% of economists polled predicted a US recession which never happened. And in 2021, 16 of the 36 living American Nobel economists declared, quote, there was no threat of inflation. In Britain, the government body tasked with forecasting, the OBR, has admitted genuine errors in its forecasts of inflation. Not surprisingly, one of the world's leading economic institutes concludes, quote, pretty much everything we could have got wrong, we got wrong. Should we conclude that 70 years after Keynes and 40 years after monetarism, we lack a robust overall economic theory and urgently need one? Can we eradicate the impact of political beliefs and assumptions in economic forecasting? Or are forecasts from economic models always going to fail to make precise predictions? And we just have to recognize that reality. Well, we've got a fantastic line of speakers with us today. Abi Innis is a political economist at the LSE whose most recent book draws surprising parallels between the UK economy and the Soviet Union. Nadeem Zahawi has been a leading Tory politician holding a variety of ministerial posts. He was appointed to the cabinet by Boris Johnson and was briefly Chancellor of the Exchequer after Sunak's resignation and before the election of Liz Truss. And Gary Stevenson was a highly successful financial trader at Citibank and has since become a campaigner against inequality and a prominent YouTuber. So in the usual fashion, I'm going to give each of them just 3 minutes to address our central question, which is, do we lack a robust economic theory and urgently need a new one? And I'm going to kick off with Abi.
Hi, hello there. Thank you for coming to this. Yes, our economic theory, our overwhelming sort of orthodoxy is completely broken, and no, we don't urgently need a new one in the sense that the very last thing we should do is say, the old science is dead, long live the new science. Because the idea of a universal science, good for all times and places, is utopian. And there's a really important difference between Keynesianism and monetarism. So Keynesianism was quite an empirical theory, and one of the things that stands Keynes apart from modern mainstream neoclassical economics is he takes uncertainty seriously. He believes we live in a radically uncertain world, and we can never escape that uncertainty. And so Keynesianism is about how can you pragmatically use fiscal and monetary policy to smooth out the booms and busts of the business cycle, of the economic cycle. The neoclassical economics that came in with Thatcherism and that has absolutely dominated economics in the global north, but also to some, a great extent in the global south, neoclassical economics is very different. It's an attempt to build a universally sound science based on mathematical reasoning from axiomatic deduction. It's not the scientific method. So it's not based on observation from reality and then theorizing. It's based on logical reasoning from assumptions, axiomatic deduction, that is then played out in formal models. And the idea is that by using mathematical formalism, you would get away from the empirical noise of social reality and you would cut through to social reality. And it's basically borrowed from physics at the end of the 19th century. The idea was to build a social physics. And what the philosophy of science would say is this is a fundamentally flawed ambition. Because what the philosophy of science in the Kantian tradition would say, there's no Archimedean point where we can stand to read the world correctly. Theory is always built on the back of previous theories. We can't escape the history of our own curiosity. We don't have godlike omniscience. So science moves through different paradigms, which are then broken by counter-evidence, which are then reformed and re-established, and we move through different paradigms. Another reason it's a fatal conceit, particularly in the social world is always becoming something else because we have imagination, because there's emerging complexity, there's novelty that comes with new technology. So even if by some miracle you chanced upon a correct universal theory, it's going to be wrong tomorrow because the way we react to it will be different. So we live with radical uncertainty. There's no Archimedean point where we can stand. The last thing we need is a universal theory of the economy.
Thank you, Abby. Nadeem.
Thank you very much, Hilary. Look, the premise of the question suggests that monetarism is a bad theory. If the pandemic has shown us anything, it's that we should have remembered the importance of its core teaching. And again, I'm going to quote Milton Friedman here, money's always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And when you print money, the Bank of England had to pump £450 billion into our economy over the pandemic. And I was the vaccine minister, you remember, during that period. And I was going to the Treasury asking for more to be able to deliver the vaccine program, but also Bayes, the business department I was in before, was asking more to deliver furlough, to deliver that safety net for businesses, for people to be able to get 85% of their wages whilst we lock down. Now, in my view, that's the right thing to do. The reason that governments exist, the reason the Bank of England exists, is to be able to smooth out the black swan events that we know happen, back to what Abby was saying about uncertainty. What does that do? Obviously, it then delivers high inflation. We got to about 11.1% inflation in our country. Therefore, there is consequences. And I think the part that certainly my government didn't do well enough was to explain the consequences. This was a sort of third world war against a virus. This was a bit like coming out of the Second World War. We never really stood up at those podiums and said, by the way, we're doing all of this, but there will be consequences. Someone has to pay for this somewhere afterwards. And I suspect that's part of the undoing of the Conservative administration that we've just witnessed. So having a basic understanding of economic concepts like these is important. We do have one very successful economic system, in my view, and I was born in Baghdad to a system that is based on national socialism, or extreme national socialism in the end with the Ba'ath Party, and therefore I hope you'll understand why I would make the argument and champion capitalism in our country, and we can talk more about this in a moment, where what is the role of the state vis-a-vis the wealth creators of this country. So the average person now, under the system of capitalism, has a living standard which exceeds that of an 18th century monarch. And therefore, hence why I say to you that capitalism is a force for good, my friends. But we currently aren't allowing it to function properly, in my view. So business people, entrepreneurs, very hard for them to maximize the benefits that they can give to society. Of course, there is the outliers, right? There are the minorities who want to abuse their position or their power. But on the whole, I think most people will set up a business, and the backbone of the economy is SMEs, not to be abusive of their employees or the system, but actually to do good. And it is often government which stands in their way and gets in their way to our society's betterment. We've also put an effective ban on building new homes and infrastructure. I don't think that's a good thing for society. But the problem is less that the overall economic theory, that we need to be much more practical, in my view, and get out of the way and listen to the wealth creators, to business. We need to spend less time arguing over an economic theory and more time making sure that the most provably successful, evidence-led strategy, economic system, we have had is able to function properly, and more time listening to those small businesses, those people who have worked in the real world, rather than pontificating over theory.
Thank you, Nadim. Gary?
Do we have a good central economic theory? No. Do we need a new one? No. What we need is to understand what's happening economically. Increasingly, the average person in this country struggles to simultaneously feed their kids and turn the heating on, which I don't know whether that was a problem for an 18th century monarch or not, but I think it's...
It's a problem for us.
I think it's important. I think it's important. Okay, let's be clear about what's happening here, okay? I've got one economics degree from the LSE, one economics degree from Oxford. We never once mentioned distribution. I started work as an interest rates trader in 2008. Everybody predicted rates would go up in 2009. They were wrong. In 2010, they were wrong. In 2011, they were wrong. In 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, they were wrong. In 2020, everybody finally agreed interest rates and inflation would never go up again, and interest rates went to 7%, okay? It's very, very clear we're bad at this. It's very, very clear we are bad at this. Now, I want to put you in the position of a 21-year-old economics graduate from an elite university with very, very, very good grades, okay? From a poor background. This was me, right? I walk into my professor's office, he says, stay here, do a master's, you've got very good grades, okay? What are my options here? I stay in academia, and then I can work in policy, I can work for government. I'd have to do a master's, a PhD, 3 or 4 years, postdoc. I'll have to work as an intern for like 3 or 4 years, making no money. Maybe 15 years down the line, I'll make some money. Or you can go into the city like I did, and I was a multimillionaire at 25, okay? Kids from poor backgrounds cannot afford to work in academia. They cannot afford to work in policy. I could not name you a single successful policy wonk, economics government minister, economist from a poor background. Every single year I was a professional trader, the most successful trader at the bank was from a working class background. This is what we've created. We've created a system which obviously takes all the good economists and said, we are going to fill your mouth with money if you shut the fuck up. You are not allowed the voice. You are not allowed the voice. And the maddest thing of it all is, when one kid leaves, and I was Citibank's most profitable trader in the year in 2011, you come out, you make excellent economic predictions in the media, on YouTube. If you don't believe it, watch my videos from 2020 where I predicted an explosion in inflation, an explosion in inequality, a collapse in living standards. The reason those predictions were good is because it's the same reason I've got a track record of making correct economic predictions for 15 years. Because I'm fucking good at this. And I could go and I could get paid £2 million a year working for any investment bank in Canary Wharf in the city, and I cannot give that information to the government for free. If that is the economic system that you build, you cannot be surprised when all of the economists are wrong about everything. All of the good traders know inequality is destroying the economy, and they don't say anything because they get paid millions of pounds a year not to.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do is, we obviously have some different political opinions on the panel.
Clearly.
But for the first theme that we're going to address, I want to focus on the question of whether we have an economic theory which makes sense of the economy, and whether we need to do something about the economic theory to some extent independent, if it's possible to be independent, of our political views. Because, as Gary identified, a very large percentage of economists got the recent behavior of the economy, not only in Britain, but in the US, wrong. So what is the issue here? Have we got the wrong theory that we're operating with? Could we, in principle, get the right one? Abby.
Thank you. I think it's as... So neoclassical economics is really a methodology, right? It's a method of reasoning from assumption. So there's some room for maneuver within that, and lots of different theories come out of it, but all of those different theories are predicated on the idea that, as it were, the ideal type is a perfectly efficient system, like it's a machine model of the economy. Most mainstream economics, the Treasury, consultancies, companies spend their lives using what gets called second-best world economics, neoclassical economics, that says, okay, the idea of perfectly competitive markets, of perfectly informed individuals, perfect balance between supply and demand, that's utopian. But it's the right heuristic, it's the right benchmark for figuring out how markets fail. So most of economics, mainstream economics, is about saying, well, how do we solve monopoly? How do we mend asymmetries in contracting? How do we make markets where they don't exist? But the metaphysics of that isn't any more neutral than the utopian ideal, because they're all aiming to complete the circuits in a presumptively completable machine.
So are you saying that...
Sorry, just to finish that thought.
Yeah,
so we're
apologies.
confusing something that is valid in logic with something you can reproduce in the social world. And that's why, after Thatcherite governments tried to implement the ideal, competition, deregulation, outsourcing, remaking the state according to making it imitate markets in a kind of theatre of markets, which is pretty much what state planning was about. It's trying to put state planning onto the table and rationalise it. So we end up with Soviet statecraft, because it's the only statecraft that makes sense in a world you think you can compute. So it's about quantification and output planning and target setting and forecasting. So we do all that. Thatcherite governments failed. New Labour came in a Khrushchevite kind of way and said, no, we can mend market failures. We'll get the best of markets and states. They spent a long time trying to mend market failures, and all the time, under the entire spectrum of neoclassical thought, we are decanting public money and authority and legitimacy away from anything that is public towards the private, towards financial markets, private sector actors, who then proceed to display none of the virtues predicted in theory, which is how we end up where we are.
I thought you were saying that we can't have an overall economic theory.
Yeah, we can't.
Okay, so I was so you think we can't have an overall economic theory, and we sort of practically should use lots of different strategies in order to make sense of where we are. Is what's going on that you're saying what's wrong that there's an attempt to impose a single overall economic theory, and that will never work?
Well, because we're using a machine model of the economy and then waiting for people and institutions and firms and financial markets to conform to the blueprint, to the machine model, and then being constantly surprised when that isn't possible. And what happens is you end up with dynamics that neoclassical economics can't even describe, let alone solve, which is where we are. What we need to get out of that is analytical pluralism. We need to step away from the idea there's one way of thinking about this, think about the problems that we want to solve, and then bring as many perspectives into the room to try and solve them, including those, most of all, who are at the sharp end of all the failures.
Okay. We need more economic pluralism, Nadim?
Analytical pluralism.
So, look,
Yes.
let me give you an analogy. So when I launched YouGov in 2000, the industry then was led by Sir Bob Worcester, then Lord Worcester of Mori, and he had convinced the whole world that what polling was about was scientific measurement of human behavior. We came along, the internet began, and we said, actually, that is a big lie. Right? No polling is based on scientific measurement. Right? We are all in the business of modeling. Right? And who can build the best model of human behavior should be the most successful pollster in the land. And I think the reason I say the analogy applies to economics is, whether I think it was Galbraith who said the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look acceptable. But that is the problem. Humans are too complex, and I think that's the point that Abby is making. So, a great example of that would be, it would be very difficult for any particular forecast to capture something that can have such an outsized impact on the economy, like the war on our continent, the Ukraine war. And I think we're in sort of violent agreement here on this. But what tends to happen with economists is there's this sort of pretense of knowledge, I think that Hayek talks about, that we are in the business of, as economics is in the scientific measurement. We're not in the business of scientific measurement, right? We are in the business of trying to predict how humans will behave. And that is tough and hard to do, but I do think there is a silver lining. So one of the things that I was talking to the team at YouGov the other day, I'm no longer involved, but I'm a huge fan of theirs, is for decade now, over a decade, we've been collecting terabytes of data from very large panels of human beings, millions of people, and we publish it as primary research or give it to the LSE or others to then do their work on. We've never been able to do what YouGov is calling connected data now. Now, supercomputing and AI, I think, will allow us to build much more sophisticated models, which I think hopefully will help decision makers in government or the Bank of England to deliver better outcomes for people.
But what you were saying in the middle of that, it seemed pretty radical by comparison to the way that it's often presented. So you were saying as I understood it, that we don't have an economic theory that is reliable, that we can't really predict what's going to happen. And of course, an enormous amount of public policy is based on exactly the reverse, that we are predicting what's going to happen. We all listen to what the predictions are for inflation this year or GDP or whatever. They're repeated endlessly on the news. You're saying all of that? Well, no, it's not the case.
But look, there is a difference between sort of pattern prediction and figuring out what's really going to happen in the economy. In terms of, say, an example would be supply and demand, and that is much more difficult. That doesn't mean we need to counsel institutions like the OBR. I think it's still worthy to be able to build models, and for decision makers, when I was in the Treasury, I need information. I need to be able to look at that and then make a judgment, hold risk, right, and get comfortable holding risk. And the one thing you've got to get comfortable with is you will not get every decision right.
Gary, are you comfortable with a sort of consensus from different points of view here that we don't have an economic theory, and in principle we can't have one that is accurate and precise? You comfortable with that?
I've spent a lot of my life having very rich people tell me it's impossible to predict the economy. I've done a pretty good job of it. I'm a multi-millionaire now. I grew up very, very poor because I continually predict the economy right.
Do you think you have an overall economic theory that's driving that decision? Or is it your hunch of thinking, well, I just got a sense of what's going on, and we can determine the future of the economy on that basis, on a sort of assessment?
Why do you think banks pay people like me £2 million a year?
I don't know, you tell me.
Because we've got a very good long-term track record of making correct predictions. Listen, economics is not a physical science. We can't do experiments. So how do we know who's good and who's bad? Well, the banks have got an idea that what you do is you look for people who consistently make correct predictions when other people don't. And they pay those people a ton of money. And listen, I want to tell you a quick story, okay? When I was just finished working in the city, I went back to university, I did a master at Oxford, 2017, 2019. We had a lesson on interest rates. I went up to the professor afterwards and I said, why do you think we've been so bad at predicting interest rates for so long? At that point, we'd incorrectly predicted interest rate rises 11 years in a row. He said, no, we always knew rates would stay zero, which is categorically, provably wrong. And I was shocked. And I said, no, we didn't. We kept saying they'd go up. And he was like, no, we knew. So I went back to my flat and I sent him the data. And he was like, oh, yeah, we did get it wrong 11 years in a row. These guys are so bad, they are unable to know that they're bad. This is literally the situation. And at the same time, you've got rooms full of people like me obsessing about what's going to happen. Obsessing about what's going to happen. And we try and work out how to predict things. And the way you predict things well is you understand them well.
Okay, Abby, so you just need good people using the theory and everything is going to be fine.
It's not just good people. You need to actually look at who has a good track record, because nobody looks at that in the public sphere, who has a good track record. And if you don't look at track record, how do people like me, who are genuinely good from poor backgrounds, bring ourselves up? Listen, I was the biggest trader at Citibank when I was 24, because I had a very good track record. And they look at people who have a good track record and bring them out. How do poor kids help the economy when they're good, when nobody cares if you're good or not. You have to check the homework.
Yeah.
So what struck me, read Gary's book, it's brilliant, and I'm going to use Gary's book here to try and make this point, which was financial markets which operate with less and less engagement with the real economy, investing in the real economy. Britain's effectively in a private and in a public sector investment famine, even as we have, one of the biggest financial markets in the world. One of the points Gary's making in the book is people didn't make money when they were right. Objectively, they made money as individual traders when other people were wrong, because it's betting, it's gambling in the main in terms of what's going on. And then in the global financial crisis, let us not forget that, because we're still paying for it, when we assumed that markets would converge on a correct pricing of risk, and categorically failed to do that, the public bailed them out. So financial markets have continue to make incredible amounts of money. Very brilliant people who are, what struck me about Gary's book is the point where you really make a ton of money, the point where you really make the best trade, is when you stop thinking about models and theory and you look outside your window and you say, inequality is now so extreme that it's sucking demand out of the economy. So you stopped thinking like a neoclassical economist in what you were trained in. You started thinking like a political economist, even a Marxist, dare I say. I'm not a Marxist, but Marx's predictions have been a hell of a lot more accurate about our economy than Milton Friedman's in terms of, driving inequality. And on that basis, you said interest rates are not going to go up, and you made millions of pounds because you were right. That was an empirical observation. It wasn't a theoretical model. And you were right. So what I would say is we need to go away from argument from axiomatic deduction and modeling and forecasting, because we live in an uncertain world, and we need to be more empirical. We need to go back to the scientific method, which is about observation of patterns, trying to make sense of those patterns, using different perspectives on how to find a way forward through that, remembering that we're always going to have to review the way we're thinking about it because the world is always turning into something else. Add the ecological crisis into that story, as we have to, and as neoclassical economics is completely myopic because it assumes that if we price nature, it'll be fine. Machine modeling for an open system world in an ecological collapse. We need to wake up to where we really are. The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature. There's a bit of realism for you. And we should recalibrate and rethink about what our priorities are, and they ought to be resilience and adaptability and regenerating human thriving nature. And for this, we're going to need a lot of problem solving, a lot of pragmatism, a lot of conversion methodologies for the way we do things so that we can change our priorities without collapsing the economy as we do it. But we ought to become very real. And the least real we have ever been in this country in the modern era is the last 45 years of neoclassical economics.
Okay. So, less economic theory, more practical engagement with stuff?
Bring it on. It's a great
How
thing.
are you still a conservative,
Why?
Nadeem? Can I? Because your party is addicted to this theology, right?
I would say to you, post-pandemic, and my experience of what we had to do to deliver the vaccine is to work collectively. And if someone can show me a better mousetrap, a better model, then
I can.
Great. Well, we should talk.
We should.
Okay.
Leave the conservative part.
Let's, at that point, move on to our next theme. Having a surprising level of agreement, in a sense, that a single economic theory which is imposed is probably a mistake, and we need maybe a more empirical engagement with alternative approaches. So, do we think that we can ever eradicate from our economic judgments our overall political beliefs and our political goals? Is economics just always sort of secondary to that bigger overall picture? Gary?
That's a good question, because obviously I worked as a trader for a long time, and as a trader you're aggressively incentivized to be right. If you're not right, you're going to lose money. If you are right, you're going to make money. And it's in a weird sense, it's wonderfully apolitical, because it doesn't matter what your political beliefs are. If you're right, you're right. And people who've read my book will know I worked with like a lot of rich people, and they are entirely convinced that the only thing that drives the big moves in the economy is growing inequality. Because they sat next to a little kid from East London who used that every year and was consistently extremely successful. And they message me and they say, what do you think is going to happen? And I say, well, inequality is going to get worse, living standards will collapse, there'll be an enormous explosion in poverty. And they say, so do you think we should buy green euro dollars? And you should, because the economy will collapse. And, I've said it before, you have to start rewarding people for being right, punishing people for being wrong, and giving the microphone to people who are right.
So that sounds like saying, yeah, we can get rid of politics from economics. It's just a question of can we predict the outcomes, and we need the people who are good at doing that. We can get rid of politics. Do you think we can get rid of politics from economics, Nadine?
No. There's a simple answer. Economists are fundamentally individuals. You're hearing it here, right? I'm not an economist. I'm an engineer by background. But they are fundamentally individuals. And they come with their own worldview, as Gary has demonstrated so successfully, and Abby has as well. So each economic theory comes with its own set of assumptions about how an economy functions, whether you're a classical liberal or otherwise, you come to it from your own worldview. And so economic decisions taken by government will never be grounded entirely in economic theory. Politicians will continue, I think, to factor in what they think their voters want when they make economic decisions. Let me give you an example of a politician who tried to go the other way and do the right thing rather than worry about the votes. One, Theresa May. You will remember the dementia tax. Yeah, she put out a manifesto that said we've got to deal with people, aging population, and we've got to effectively transform the system. She almost lost the election because of it and had to row back very, very quickly. And so, answer is no.
Abby?
So no, I don't think, I'm a political economist, so I think the question of who pays and who gains is a fundamentally political question. But it is, it was the conceit and the ambition of neoclassical economics at the beginning of the 20th century to make it a science, to exactly strip out the politics and the centuries of political philosophy about what the good society looks like and say, no, we can dump all of that. We can get away from the art of government to a science in the allocation of things. And of course, the dark historical joke of the 20th century, in my view, is that the neoclassical science in the allocation of things is exactly the mirror image of Soviet economics, which was also a science in the allocation of things when it moved to Stalinist central planning. The idea of a perfectly free market and a perfect central plan are exact formal mirror images, which is why the book is called Late Soviet Britain. But there is nothing more political, it seems to me, than saying economics is a technical science, so people who are not economists do not have a legitimate voice to speak about it, in the sense that it's a technocratic science, and in that sense it's totalitarian in the strict political science sense, because it's saying there is a scientific blueprint of the good society to which all institutions and forms of government and social behavior should be encouraged to conform on the basis that that will lead us to the state of perpetual peace. It's basically secular theology. It's an image of the Judeo-Christian Eden that we can achieve if only we follow this science. And the irony is that the biggest claim that it's not political has turned out to be the most totalizing politics democratic Britain has ever seen, and we're living with the consequences of the failure of that science, which is why I think we all feel so sort of profoundly pessimistic about the future, because we're in a system in which literally nothing works in the way we were told it would work.
But, Garrett's point was that the traders, at least some of the traders, make right predictions in the sense of accurate predictions. So are you saying, no, that's not really correct, that there is no such thing as an accurate prediction? We can't do that because it's always bound up with our political views.
Yes, you can't know what's accurate in an objective sense. It might be accurate in the immediate sense that you're beating the person the people you're trading against. You win the bet. But the idea that you win the bet is a contingent fact. It's not an objective truth that is a reflection of the deeper state of the economy, right? You're not reading the economy correctly in some objective sense. You're reading it correctly in the short term in a very contingent sense. All the traders who made millions of pounds up to the global financial crisis were correct up until the point where the music stopped. Their predictions were correct, and then the music stopped in terms of the credibility of the entire activity collapsed, and then everybody lost.
So you think that actually the notion that there are people who can predict correctly is a mistake, that they might be able to predict correctly for a bit, but actually they don't really have an overall account which enables them to predict more effectively in the longer term?
Well, and if you look at how Goldman Sachs was so successful in the financial crisis, they bet on it going up and down, right? I mean, if you bet every which way, you're going to make money. What's happening to the real economy is a kind of extraneous event, but we live in the real economy, so we should care about the fact that you can make money on the economy going up and down.
Okay. You can't be right all the time?
I mean, you can't be right all the time, but I think it is possible to understand the economy. Not completely, not perfectly. But I mean, is it possible for a doctor to make a right diagnosis? Is it possible for a car mechanic to fix your car?
But those are fundamentally different things. Because a car is a closed system machine, and we understand the chemistry and the mechanics of a machine so that it won't change its mind, right? A diesel engine doesn't suddenly decide to be the fairy queen, right? I mean, we understand all its properties, and it's highly predictable, and the range of errors are also completely predictable. Human society is not like that because we're imaginative, and we live in incredibly complex, interdependent systems that are themselves ever-changing. So it is a kind of, it's an aspiration to, well, even religion has more humility than that, because the major religions of the world say, like St. Paul, we see through a glass darkly, right? They don't claim to be a science. Mainstream economics is extraordinary. It sort of claims to be, I mean, economists who use it know that it's a thought experiment. The real problem is when politicians believe it and say, we've got the answer.
Yeah. I look forward to Rachel Reeves telling us that her next prediction is a thought experiment.
As she should.
Let's move on to the last theme, which is what do we think we should do in order to, across the panel's acceptance that economic theory has obviously made lots of mistakes, or the way that we've understood the economy, lots of mistakes over the last decade or two, maybe a great deal longer than that. But what should we do now to change that situation so that we do it better in future? Gary.
Well, I mean, I've got a very clear theory about what is happening in our specific economy now, our specific problem. I don't claim for it to be some grand central theory of economics forever. I think wealth inequality has increased very quickly. It continues to increase very quickly. Inequality in living standards continues to increase very quickly. Just to explain to you, I mean, Nadeem Zahawi mentioned the 450 billion pounds of QE. Do you know what the total UK government deficit is since the beginning of COVID?
Do tell us.
Does anyone know? Total UK government deficit. It's £1 trillion. Do you know what that is per UK adult? It's £20,000 per UK adult. The UK government has given out enough money to give £20,000 to every single adult in the country. Not every single household, every single adult. All of you, all of your parents, all of your siblings, all of your friends, £20,000 each. Do we know who has that money now? Are you all £20,000 richer, cash? Honestly, the most amazing thing I've ever witnessed in my life was that the US number is 10 trillion. All of the governments in the world gave out unbelievably enormous amounts of money. Nobody, not the Conservatives, not Labour, not Oxford University, not the think tanks, even asked who is going to end up £1 trillion richer. Nobody even asked that. It's so amazing, it's nearly beautiful. And these are people who are very well educated, very prestigious. They didn't even ask the question. Listen, I'm going to be very clear. I've got a very clear objective here. If you do not stop, I'm not even talking about reducing inequality. If you do not stop inequality from rising enormously rapidly, we literally pause the economy, gave the richest people in the country £1 trillion and were surprised when living standards fell. It's unbelievable. You need to stop inequality from rising. And what that means for a grand theory of economics, I don't really care. I want my friends to be able to feed their children. And you need to stop inequality from rising if you want to achieve that.
If your question is to give up on the idea that any economic model or forecast is viable, then I think that's a mistake. I think if we use no forecasting at all, it will, one, I think, generate further uncertainty, further volatility. The policy-making process then could become much more grounded in political ideology, and that would worry me. There's also, I think, nothing inherently wrong with using economic models or forecast. After all, if you think about it, how you build a startup or a business, you try and forecast to the best of your ability on the information available to you to make future plans for your business. And so it would be a mistake, in my view, to just throw the baby out with the bathwater.
But you would accept that...
But we should, that's what I'm going to come to the point, is that we should be honest about the fact that economic models are never going to be 100% accurate or able to forecast what will happen to the economy if a certain policy is imposed. So I think good economics and good economic models are not meant to be definitively correct. That was my attitude in the Treasury. Economists are meant to, I think, acknowledge the existence of exogenous factors, so stuff that can happen outside or of the sort of known model. We in the Treasury were very, very used to historically using static linear modeling versus sort of dynamic modeling. And what I tried to do when I was there to say, look, we need to move away from that. And I think that is something that is beginning to happen. I can give you a sort of couple of examples, and we've done some work at the Adam Smith Institute. So the IFS came up with a model for what happens if you apply VAT to schools, which Rachel Reeve took on and picked up. We at the Adam Smith said, actually, we're not sure what would happen, and there are sort of three scenarios that could happen. And I think I would advocate for dynamic modeling rather than just sort of a much more certain way of policy making.
But it just in a purely economic, from an economic point of view, you would accept that a very large proportion of economists, including the Bank of England and the Treasury, got the predictions about the inflation wildly wrong and maintained getting it wrong, even though there were an increasing number of voices saying this is a mistake. And what do you think should be done now in the sense of our economic understanding? What should change in the light of that empirical evidence that the theory didn't work, it didn't predict the right stuff, and we got it wildly wrong?
So a couple of things on that, and I think I referred to it earlier. The bit that, and I'm not making excuses here, but the black swan moment was Putin deciding to invade Ukraine, right? And he kept reassuring the world that he was never going to do this. That was not his intention, and all of our intelligence was coming and saying exactly the opposite. And we tried very hard with him to say, do not do this. But war on our continent is a pretty big deal, and it actually drove much of the inflation that you saw. Of course, the response to the pandemic, which I think was the right one, by the way, to protect people's wages and protect businesses. We've had a massive scarring effect on the economy because the majority of businesses that would have gone under, not the large cap, it would have been the small businesses that would have absolutely collapsed if we hadn't intervened the way we had done. But there are black swan moments that you've got to sort of be. I think be humble is probably the response I would say to my colleagues in government today.
Indeed, the Bank of England and the government did use the invasion of Ukraine to explain the failure to predict the increase in inflation. And undoubtedly, I'm sure everyone would accept that it helped drive inflation. But long before that was the invasion of Ukraine, there was inflation in the economy which had not been predicted.
Very true.
And the question is, what was wrong with our model that should have resulted in such a failure?
And that's an important question. I hope my old team are sort of looking at some of this stuff now and trying to recalibrate. Look, you do it I mean, again, I go back to polling. We do it after every general election. The pollsters through the British Polling Council will get together and try and work out what mistakes they made in their predictions. They predicted a Labour majority of 20 points. It only came in at just shy of 10. And I think humble enough to know that we're in the business of modelling, not scientific measurement, right? To be able to build better models, I hope, for the future. But the one other thing that I think did fuel inflation is obviously the pandemic in China and how China handled the pandemic on supply chains. And then beyond that, the sort of political tension between China and NATO. So all of that, I think, is...
And QE?
And of course. And I mentioned that right at the outset, before people berated me for it.
Okay, I mean...
Thank you. I think we don't need to think in binary terms. Just because we don't know everything doesn't mean we know nothing. And neoclassical economics has its uses. Contract theory is really interesting about how if people have different information, as they sign a contract with someone else, they're systematically at a disadvantage over time. All that kind of stuff's pretty useful and pretty interesting. But it's one way of looking at the world with a lot of other very useful ways of looking at the world that are much more grounded in reality and are not based on fundamental utopian assumptions, which mathematical neoclassical economics is, the most utopian of which is the most fundamental assumption, which is that we're all rational cost-benefit maximizing individuals, that we operate on a single plane of value, right? I mean, I don't know, does that describe you? I don't think it describes me. So we're trying to conform to this blueprint based in this kind of two-dimensional space. And if we feel like we're ever less three-dimensional, ever less joyful, ever less imaginative, that's because we're trying to conform to this two-dimensional utopia that can't work. So I think we should go to analytical pluralism. You know, we shouldn't abandon neoclassical economics entirely. But like any other science, we should bring in a whole bunch of other theories, but we should start being empirical. We should start looking at the economy as it is, poverty being one of the... Poverty and the ecological crisis, I would say, are the two overriding calamities of our time, and they're not unconnected. So we should focus on those. And then we should think about what do we want the world to look like? You know, because it is political, social purpose, the things we choose are independently causative in the world. The world is not a computable system. It's not pre-established and we're just trying to navigate our way with forecasts in it. It's something that we're making and remaking all the time, and we can remake it for the better or the worse. And I think as soon as we realize that we can use lots of different theories, we can have lots of different purposes, what an incredibly liberating idea that is. I mean, and it has the merit of being true.
The strange thing is that in some ways that's quite similar to what Nadim was saying, wasn't it? In the sense of he wants to operate with the models that we're doing at the moment. He doesn't think, a single overall one. And just think, okay, we got it wrong. We need to try and tinker with our models to see whether we can get it closer in the future.
But I think the fixation on thinking if we get the model right, or we could use AI, it's like Soviet cybernetics in the 1960s. If we just get the right methodology, we can give up this exhausting curiosity about the world and this exhausting need to make moral decisions, and we can lay back and give up responsibility, and the whole clockwork cosmos will work beautifully for us. It is such a rabbit hole, and we are all the way down the bottom. And so I think just as an analytical stance, if you say the world is not computable, and so forecasting, interesting thought experiment, it's not what we ought to be sort of focusing on. Society is an ecosystem like any other ecosystem. We're creatures like any other creatures. The economy is much more like a garden than a watch. If you think in those terms, it changes the entire nature of what you think you're doing in the world when you run a company, or you set up an SME, or you teach children, or you do any of the things that, keep us going. And so let's get away from small dreams of electric sheep and forecasting what the electric sheep are going to do, and start thinking about how do we want society to look, and what are the immediate problems, and how can we solve them. And let's do it on the understanding not that there is a kind of clerisy of economists who have unique access to wisdom and the interpretation of the world. And remember that all our knowledge, all our experience is absolutely relevant. We won't solve anything unless we remember that we have collective intelligence. Bring a lot of different voices into the room. You have as much knowledge as you can ever attain about how to solve the problem in front of you. So let's get away from, engineers of human souls, because boy, do they get it wrong.
So I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I'd like to, of course, thank our speakers, Abby Innes, Nadeem Zahawi, and Gary Stevenson, for a fascinating conversation.